Imagine moving into your dream home, only to be greeted with hate by your new neighbor. What this black family didn't know was the full extent of their neighbor's bigotry, nor did the neighbor know that this family owned the entire block. You won't believe what happens next. It was a bright, clear morning when the Jefferson family finally pulled up to their new home. The moving truck followed close behind, rumbling down the quiet, tree-lined street of what was supposed to be a fresh start. Daniel and Lisa Jefferson, along with their two children, Madison and Ethan, had worked for years to save up enough to buy their dream house. It wasn't just any house. It was a sprawling, beautifully renovated home in an upscale neighborhood. For them, this was more than just a move. It was a symbol of everything they had worked for, a reward for their perseverance, hard work, and dreams. Daniel stepped out of the car first, taking a deep breath as he looked up at the house. Its freshly painted white walls gleamed in the sunlight, and the wide front porch seemed to beckon them inside. "We did it," he whispered to himself, a mixture of pride and relief washing over him. Lisa stepped out next, her eyes scanning the front yard, imagining the kids playing in the garden, their laughter filling the air. Madison and Ethan were already excitedly discussing who would get which room, their voices bubbling with anticipation as they jumped out of the car. "Come on, kids, let's start unpacking," Lisa called, her voice cheerful as she made her way to the front door. She smiled at Daniel, squeezing his hand. This was the life they had envisioned for their children: safety, comfort, and the chance to grow up in a beautiful, peaceful neighborhood. But as they started to unload boxes from the truck, Daniel noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Across the street, standing stiffly on the front lawn of the neighboring house, was an older man. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, and his face was set in a deep frown. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. In fact, he made no effort to greet them at all. Daniel gave him a polite nod, expecting at least a curt acknowledgement in return. Instead, the man just stared back at him, his gaze cold and unwelcoming. Lisa noticed too. "I guess we're not getting any welcome cookies from him," she muttered under her breath, trying to lighten the mood, though Daniel could sense the discomfort in her voice. The man across the street was their neighbor, Raymond Thompson. He had lived in the neighborhood for over 2 decades, watching as families moved in and out. Most of the time, he barely noticed the changes, but this was different. The Jeffersons were not like the others who had lived in the neighborhood before. As he stood on his lawn, watching them unload, a knot of anger began to form in his chest. "What are they doing here?" Raymond grumbled to himself, his lips thinning as he watched Daniel carry a large box into the house. He turned sharply and marched back inside his own home, slamming the door behind him. Inside their new home, the Jefferson family had no idea what was brewing just across the street. They were too busy enjoying the excitement of moving into their dream home. As they unpacked the first few boxes, Daniel noticed the gleam in his children's eyes as they explored the spacious rooms. The high ceilings, polished wood floors, and large windows filled the house with light. It was everything they had hoped for. "Mom, come look at this," Ethan called excitedly from upstairs, his voice echoing down the hallway. He was already staking his claim on the room with the biggest window, while Madison explored the backyard, envisioning where her swing set could go. Lisa laughed, her heart swelling with joy. "It's perfect, isn't it?" she said, her voice filled with pride. But there was a quiet concern lingering in the back of her mind, a slight unease she couldn't shake after the brief, cold encounter with their neighbor. She pushed the thought away for now, choosing to focus on the happiness of the moment. That evening, as the sun began to set and the moving truck had long since left, the family sat down for their first dinner in the new house. Boxes were still scattered around the kitchen, but they didn't mind. Daniel had picked up pizza from a local spot, and they ate together around the kitchen island, laughing about the chaos of moving and all the little mishaps that had happened throughout the day. But just as the mood had lightened, a loud knock echoed through the house. Daniel and Lisa exchanged confused glances. They weren't expecting anyone. Lisa quickly wiped her hands and went to answer the door, with Daniel following close behind. Standing at the front door was Raymond, his face set in a grim expression. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "You folks just moved in, huh?" His tone was clipped, almost accusatory. Lisa smiled politely, though the man's unfriendly demeanor was hard to miss. "Yes, we did. We're the Jeffersons. It's nice to meet you," she offered, extending her hand. Raymond ignored her hand and looked over at Daniel. "You planning on staying long?" he asked, his gaze sharp and unwelcoming. Daniel felt his chest tighten, sensing the undercurrent of hostility in the man's voice. "We plan to," he replied, keeping his tone measured. "We just bought the place." Raymond's eyes narrowed, as if he were assessing whether or not Daniel was telling the truth. He glanced over the house and back at the family, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Well, I hope you know this isn't the kind of neighborhood for disruptions," he said, his words heavy with implication. "We like to keep things a certain way around here." Lisa's smile faltered slightly, but she kept her tone polite. "We're looking forward to being part of the community." Raymond didn't seem convinced. He nodded curtly, though there was no warmth behind it, and turned to leave without another word. As he walked back across the street, Lisa closed the door, her heart racing. "Well, that was interesting," she said, glancing at Daniel, who stood silent for a moment, his jaw clenched. "Yeah," Daniel finally said, his voice low. "I think we've just met our first challenge in this neighborhood." They didn't need to say anything else. The weight of Raymond's words hung in the air, a reminder that not everyone was happy to see them there. But as the Jeffersons finished their dinner that night, they resolved to stay strong. This was their home now, and no neighbor, no matter how hostile, was going to change that. The days following their awkward encounter with Raymond Thompson were quiet, but uneasy. The Jeffersons continued settling into their new home, but the tension in the air was hard to ignore. Every morning, as Daniel left for work and Lisa walked the kids to the nearby park, they felt the watchful eyes of their neighbor across the street. Raymond would stand in his driveway, arms crossed, glaring at them with barely concealed contempt. He never spoke, but his presence was a constant reminder that they weren't welcome in his eyes. Despite the tension, Lisa tried to maintain a positive outlook. "He'll come around," she told Daniel one evening, as they unpacked boxes in the living room. "Maybe he just needs time to adjust." Daniel wasn't so sure. "I don't know, Lisa. Something about him feels off. He doesn't seem like the type to just come around." He glanced out the window, catching a glimpse of Raymond's house across the street, the curtains shifting slightly as if someone had been watching them. The real trouble began a week later. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the kids were outside playing in the front yard. Madison and Ethan laughed and ran around, their voices echoing through the quiet neighborhood. They were playing a simple game of tag, darting between the trees and the front porch, their joy infectious. For a moment, everything felt normal, just a family enjoying their weekend in their new home. But then, out of nowhere, Raymond appeared again. This time, he didn't just watch from a distance. He marched across the street, his face set in a hard scowl, and headed straight toward Lisa, who was sitting on the porch watching her children play. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice sharp and irritated. Lisa looked up, surprised to see him coming over. She stood up, brushing the dirt off her hands from the gardening she'd been doing earlier. "Yes?" she asked, her voice polite but cautious. Raymond stopped a few feet away from her, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the children. "Do you mind keeping your kids quiet? They're disturbing the peace." Lisa blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" "They're running around, shouting like wild animals," Raymond snapped. "This isn't some kind of playground. People around here value their peace and quiet." Lisa's chest tightened. She could feel her pulse quicken, the heat rising in her cheeks. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. "They're just playing. It's the middle of the afternoon. I don't think they're bothering anyone." Raymond crossed his arms, his scowl deepening. "Well, I'm bothered. And so are some of the other neighbors. This kind of behavior isn't what we're used to around here." Lisa felt her heart sink. She knew exactly what he meant by this kind of behavior. She had heard it before, in different forms, from different people. But here, In this neighborhood, she hadn't expected it to come so soon, so openly. "Look," she said, keeping her voice steady. "We're not here to cause any problems. My kids are just being kids. They're not doing anything wrong." Raymond's eyes flashed with irritation. "You might not think so, but this neighborhood has standards, and we intend to keep it that way." Without another word, he turned on his heel and marched back across the street, leaving Lisa standing on the porch, her hands trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. She glanced over at her children, who had stopped playing and were now watching her with wide eyes, sensing the tension in the air. "It's okay, kids," she called out, forcing a smile. "Go ahead and keep playing." But as she sat back down, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse. Later that evening, when Daniel came home from work, Lisa told him about the confrontation. As she recounted Raymond's words, Daniel's jaw tightened and his hands balled into fists at his sides. "I knew that man was trouble," he muttered, pacing the length of the living room. "He's not just unfriendly. He's looking for reasons to cause problems." Lisa nodded, her heart heavy. "What are we supposed to do? I don't want the kids to feel like they can't play outside in their own yard. This is supposed to be our home, Daniel." "I know," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. "But we're not going to let him intimidate us. This is our home, and we have every right to be here." Despite his words, Lisa could see the frustration in his eyes. They had worked so hard to get to this point, to buy this house, to give their children a better life. And now they were being made to feel like outsiders in their own neighborhood. The following week, Raymond took things a step further. One morning, as Lisa was walking back from the park with the kids, she noticed something unusual on the community bulletin board near the entrance of the neighborhood. A new flyer had been posted, written in bold red letters. "Keep our neighborhood safe. Stop the noise and chaos before it's too late." Lisa stopped in her tracks, her eyes scanning the flyer. It didn't mention their family directly, but the implications were clear. The words noise and chaos were obvious jabs at her children, at her family. Her hands shook as she ripped the flyer down, crumpling it in her fist. When she got home, Daniel was waiting for her on the porch, his expression grim. "I just got off the phone with the HOA, he said. "Apparently, someone's been complaining about us. Guess who?" Lisa sighed, sinking down onto the porch steps beside him. "Let me guess, Raymond?" "Yup," Daniel replied, his tone bitter. "He's been calling the HOA non-stop, complaining about everything from the kids making noise to the way we've been parking our cars. He's determined to make our lives miserable." "What did the HOA say?" Lisa asked, her voice tight with worry. "They said they have to look into it, but they're not exactly taking his side. I think they're used to dealing with people like him." Lisa let out a slow breath, her mind racing. "What are we going to do, Daniel? I don't want to keep fighting with him." "We're not going to fight," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. "We're going to keep living our lives, just like we've been doing. He doesn't get to control us." Lisa nodded, though the weight of the situation was starting to press down on her. She knew Daniel was right. They couldn't let Raymond win. But she also knew that this was just the beginning. Raymond wasn't going to give up easily. As they sat there together, the quiet of the neighborhood surrounding them, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced across the street, toward Raymond's house, and saw the curtains shift slightly, as if someone had just been peeking out. Her heart sank. That night, as she lay in bed, Lisa replayed the events of the past week in her mind. The confrontations, the glares, the thinly veiled threats. She had dealt with racism before, but something about this felt different. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a slow, deliberate attempt to push them out, to make them feel unwelcome in their own home. But as she drifted off to sleep, one thought kept running through her mind. They weren't going anywhere. The days turned into weeks, and despite the Jefferson family's best efforts to remain calm and composed, Raymond Thompson's hostility only grew more overt. What had started as passive-aggressive remarks and subtle glares quickly escalated into something much more sinister. One morning, Daniel woke up to find that someone had spray-painted the word "Go" in bold black letters on their driveway. The graffiti was sloppy, but the message was clear. He stood there for a moment, staring at the words, his chest tightening with a mix of anger and frustration. He knew exactly who was behind it, but proving it was another matter. Lisa found him standing on the porch, arms crossed, staring at the driveway in silence. Her heart sank when she saw the graffiti. Oh no. "Daniel, what do we do now?" Daniel shook his head, his face hard with resolve. "We clean it up. That's what we do. We don't give him the satisfaction of seeing us react." They spent the next hour scrubbing the paint off the driveway, working in silence as the sun rose higher in the sky. Every now and then, Daniel glanced across the street, half expecting to see Raymond standing there, watching them with that smug look on his face, but the curtains in his house remained still, giving no sign of life. As Lisa scrubbed at the pavement, her mind raced with a mix of anger and anxiety. How far is he going to take this? She wondered aloud. Daniel wiped his brow and sighed. As far as we let him. His voice was steady, but Lisa could hear the tension beneath it. He was trying to be strong, to be the protector, but she knew this was wearing on him. That same afternoon, the Jeffersons got a knock at the door. Daniel opened it to find a woman standing on the porch, holding a clipboard and smiling brightly. She looked familiar, though Daniel couldn't quite place her. "Hi there," she said cheerfully, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Susan, from the Homeowners Association. I just wanted to stop by and have a little chat with you folks." Daniel frowned slightly, but stepped aside to let her in. Lisa joined them in the living room, her face carefully neutral as she sat down across from the woman. "I've just been hearing a few concerns from some of the neighbors," Susan began, her tone light but laced with an underlying tension. "It seems there have been some complaints about noise, disturbances, and, well, just some general concerns about the neighborhood's peace and quiet." Lisa and Daniel exchanged a glance. They both knew where this was coming from. "We're not doing anything wrong," Daniel said firmly. "Our kids are just playing outside like any other kids, and we're living our lives just like anyone else." Susan nodded, her smile faltering slightly. Of course, I'm sure you're not causing any problems, but you know how it is. Some people can be a bit sensitive about changes in the neighborhood. I'm just here to mediate and make sure everyone feels comfortable." Lisa narrowed her eyes slightly, her patience wearing thin. "Are you talking about Raymond Thompson?" Susan's expression flickered, but she recovered quickly. "Well, I'm not here to point fingers, but I think it's important to keep in mind that we have certain standards in this neighborhood, and we want to make sure everyone is adhering to them." Daniel felt his jaw clench. "Are you saying we're not adhering to the standards?" "Oh, no," Susan said quickly, her hands waving dismissively. "I'm just saying that maybe it would be helpful to tone things down a bit, keep the noise level to a minimum, maybe avoid any activities that could be seen as disruptive." Lisa sat up straighter, her voice steady but firm. "We're not doing anything wrong, and we're certainly not going to change how we live our lives because one person has a problem with us." Susan's smile faded entirely, replaced by a tight-lipped expression. She flipped through the papers on her clipboard before standing up. "Well, I just wanted to check in and make sure everything was going smoothly. If you have any concerns, feel free to reach out to the HOA with that." She made her way to the door, her cheerful demeanor completely gone. Lisa and Daniel watched her leave, their frustration simmering beneath the surface. Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. Lisa joined him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We knew it wouldn't be easy," she said quietly. "I just didn't think it would be this hard," Daniel admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We've dealt with racism before, but this feels different. It's like he's trying to break us." Lisa nodded, her heart aching for her husband. "We're not going to let him, Daniel. We've come too far for that." "I know," Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples, But I'm worried. What if it gets worse? What if he does something, I don't know, more dangerous? Lisa was quiet for a moment, weighing his words. She had been thinking the same thing, but she didn't want to admit it out loud. We'll take it one step at a time, she finally said. We'll keep documenting everything, and if things get worse, we'll get the authorities involved. But deep down they both knew that involving the authorities might not be the solution they hoped for. After all, Raymond had already tried to weaponize the HOA against them. What would stop him from going further? A few days later, Raymond made his next move. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and Lisa was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the kids play in the front yard. They had been extra careful since the confrontation with Raymond, trying to keep their voices down and avoid any unnecessary conflict. But despite their best efforts, Raymond wasn't satisfied. As Lisa sat there, she noticed Raymond across the street talking to a group of neighbors. He stood with his arms crossed, gesturing toward the Jeffersons' house as he spoke in low, angry tones. The other neighbors nodded along, some casting uneasy glances in Lisa's direction. A sinking feeling settled in Lisa's chest. She could tell from their body language that they were plotting something that wouldn't end well for her family. Later that afternoon, as Daniel came home from work, Lisa told him about what she had seen. "He's rallying the neighbors against us," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "I don't know what he's telling them, but it can't be good." Daniel shook his head, his expression grim. "He's trying to isolate us, to make us feel like we don't belong here. It's classic." Lisa nodded, her stomach churning with anxiety. "What do? We keep living our lives," Daniel said firmly. "We don't let him win." But as the days went on, the tension in the neighborhood grew. More flyers appeared on the community bulletin board, this time explicitly mentioning the Jefferson family by name. The whispers and stares became more frequent, and soon Lisa and Daniel began to notice that some of the neighbors, who had once waved or smiled at them, were now avoiding eye contact, crossing the street to avoid walking past their house. It was a slow, deliberate effort to make them feel unwelcome, and it was working. That night, as Lisa and Daniel sat together in the quiet of their home, they both felt the weight of the situation pressing down on them. But as they talked, they also knew that they had something Raymond didn't, a plan. "I spoke to the real estate agent today," Daniel said, his voice low as he glanced toward the windows, making sure no one was watching. "It's all going through. The deal should close in a few weeks." Lisa's eyes widened, a spark of hope lighting up her chest. "So it's really happening?" Daniel nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, he has no idea what's coming." Lisa felt a rush of relief wash over her. For weeks, they had been quietly working on a plan, something that would turn the tables on Raymond in a way he could never have imagined. And now, it was finally coming together. Raymond thought he could push them out, but what he didn't know was that the Jeffersons weren't just another family moving into the neighborhood. They were about to become the owners of the entire block. The days that followed were a roller coaster of emotions for the Jefferson family. The tension in the neighborhood reached an all-time high. Neighbors who had once been indifferent or even friendly were now cold and distant. Lisa could feel the stares whenever she stepped outside. Walking the kids to the park, going to the grocery store, everything felt like walking through a minefield, each glance from a neighbor carrying hidden judgments. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Lisa sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched dinner. Daniel had been working late, trying to keep his mind off the growing conflict, while the kids were unusually quiet, sensing the tension in the air. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the life they had hoped to build in this neighborhood was slipping through their fingers. A loud knock at the door startled Lisa out of her thoughts. She wasn't expecting anyone, especially not this late. Her heart raced as she got up, but when she opened the door, her stomach dropped. Standing there was Raymond, flanked by two other men from the neighborhood, both of whom had been a part of the group he had gathered the other day. Raymond's face was a mask of smug satisfaction, his arms crossed over his chest. "We need to talk," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Lisa swallowed hard, but she stood her ground. About what? Raymond stepped forward, glancing over her shoulder into the house. We've had enough of your little disturbances, he sneered, his voice growing colder with each word. This is a quiet, respectable neighborhood, and we've all agreed that your family doesn't fit in here, so we're going to make it easy for you. It's time for you to leave. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. We're not going anywhere, she said, her voice steady. This is our home. Raymond's eyes narrowed, and one of the men behind him let out a low chuckle. You think this is your home? Lady, you don't belong here. None of you do. Lisa's blood ran cold. She had heard this kind of rhetoric before, but hearing it here, in what was supposed to be their peaceful sanctuary, cut deeper than she expected. We bought this house fair and square, Lisa continued, her voice unwavering despite the tightness in her throat. We're not leaving just because you don't like the way we look. Raymond's face twisted into a sneer. I don't care how much money you have or how many lawyers you can call. You don't belong in this neighborhood, and we'll make sure you understand that, one way or another. Before Lisa could respond, Daniel appeared at her side, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. He had overheard the conversation as he came in from the garage, and his face was set in a hard line. What's going on here? Daniel asked, his voice firm but calm. Raymond didn't back down. We're just making it clear that this isn't the place for your family. Daniel stepped closer, his gaze locked on Raymond. Let me tell you something, he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet intensity. We're not going anywhere. We've worked hard for this, just like everyone else in this neighborhood, and we're not going to let you or anyone else push us out. Raymond scoffed, shaking his head. We'll see about that. The two men behind Raymond shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Daniel and Lisa. They had come here expecting a confrontation, but they hadn't anticipated the quiet strength the Jeffersons would show in the face of their intimidation. Raymond, however, wasn't about to back down. With a final sneer, he turned on his heel and stormed off, the two men following close behind him without a word. As the door closed behind them, Lisa let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with adrenaline. Daniel wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. I can't believe he would come here like that, Lisa whispered, her voice breaking. He's not going to stop, Daniel. He's going to keep coming after us. Daniel held her tighter, his chin resting on top of her head. I know, he said softly, but we're stronger than him. We're not going to let him win. That night, Lisa lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The conversation with Raymond kept replaying in her mind, his hateful words echoing in the quiet of the house. She had dealt with racism before, but there was something about Raymond's anger that felt more personal, more targeted. He wasn't just trying to intimidate them, he was trying to break them. Beside her, Daniel slept fitfully, the day's events weighing heavily on his mind as well. They had been through so much together, but this felt different. It felt like a test, one that would determine whether or not they truly belonged in this neighborhood, in this life they had worked so hard to build. Lisa rolled over, looking out the window at the dark street outside. For a moment, she thought about giving in, about leaving and finding somewhere else to live, where they wouldn't have to deal with people like Raymond. But then she thought about their kids, about the life they had promised them, about the future they had fought so hard to secure. We're not going anywhere, she whispered to herself, her resolve hardening. The next morning, as the family sat down for breakfast, Lisa noticed how quiet the kids were. Madison and Ethan picked at their cereal, their usual chatter noticeably absent. It wasn't until Madison finally spoke up that Lisa realized how deeply the tension in the neighborhood was affecting them. Mom? Madison said quietly, her eyes fixed on her bowl. Why does Mr. Thompson hate us? Lisa's heart sank. She glanced at Daniel, who sighed heavily before turning to his daughter. Madison, sometimes people don't like others because they're different. It doesn't make sense, and it's not fair, but it happens. But we haven't done anything wrong, Ethan added, his voice small and confused. Why does he act like we're bad people? Lisa's throat tightened as she looked at her children, their innocent faces clouded with confusion and hurt. They were too young to understand the full extent of what was happening, but they could feel it. The hostility, the hatred, the tension that hung over their home like a dark cloud. Daniel leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You're right. We haven't done anything wrong, and we're not bad people. But some people, like Mr. Thompson, don't understand that. They judge others based on what they look like, not who they are, and that's wrong. But we're not going to let that stop us from living our lives. This is our home, and we have just as much right to be here as anyone else." Madison and Ethan nodded slowly, though their expressions remained troubled. Lisa reached out and took their hands, offering a reassuring smile. "We're a family, and we're strong. As long as we stick together, we'll be okay." Later that day, Daniel and Lisa sat together in the living room, discussing their next steps. They knew they couldn't just sit back and let Raymond continue his campaign of hate. It was time to take action. "I've been documenting everything," Daniel said, holding up a small notebook filled with dates and details of every encounter they'd had with Raymond. "If this escalates any further, we'll have a solid case against him." Lisa nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. She had been thinking about their long-term plan, the one they had been quietly working on in the background. The real estate deal was still in progress, but soon, very soon, everything would change. "Do you think he has any idea?" Lisa asked, her voice low. Daniel shook his head. "Not a clue. He thinks he's got the upper hand, but when the time comes—" Lisa smiled, a glimmer of hope lighting up her eyes. "He's in for a big surprise." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of their situation still heavy but not as suffocating as it had been before. They had a plan, a way to fight back, not with anger or violence, but with something far more powerful, the truth. As the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across the quiet street, the Jeffersons stood together on their front porch, watching the neighborhood settle into the night. They could feel the tension in the air, the silent judgment of their neighbors weighing down on them like a lead blanket. But they weren't afraid anymore. They weren't backing down. Because soon, everyone, especially Raymond, would know the truth. The morning started like any other, with the Jefferson family trying to go about their day as usual despite the growing tension. Daniel had left early for work, while Lisa prepared the kids for school. The house was quiet, but the sense of unease still lingered, as if it was waiting to explode. Little did Lisa know that today would be the day that Raymond Thompson crossed a line no one could ignore. As Lisa gathered her things to run errands after dropping off the kids, a loud knock echoed through the house. She paused, her heart sinking. She wasn't expecting anyone, and after everything that had happened, every knock on the door felt like it could bring more trouble. She opened the door cautiously, and there stood two uniformed police officers, their faces unreadable. "Good morning, ma'am," one of the officers said, tipping his hat slightly. "We received a complaint from one of your neighbors and need to ask you a few questions." Lisa's pulse quickened, but she kept her face calm. "What kind of complaint?" she asked, though deep down, she already knew the answer. The officer shifted uncomfortably before continuing. "Mr. Thompson, across the street, filed a report saying there's been ongoing disturbance and loitering on your property. He claims that there's been excessive noise and suspicious activity." Lisa's heart pounded in her chest as anger bubbled to the surface. "Suspicious activity," she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "We've done nothing but mind our own business. My children play outside and we live in our home, just like anyone else in this neighborhood." The second officer nodded, a sympathetic look crossing his face. "We understand, ma'am. We just have to follow up on every complaint we receive. It doesn't look like there's any real issue here, but we need to document it all the same." Lisa glanced across the street, and sure enough, there was Raymond, standing on his porch, arms crossed, watching the whole scene unfold with a smug smile on his face. Her blood boiled. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, calculated move to humiliate them. Taking a deep breath, Lisa turned back to the officers. "You're welcome to take a look around, But as you can see, everything is perfectly normal." The officers exchanged a glance before nodding. They took a brief walk around the property, checking the front and backyard, before returning to the porch. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Jefferson," one of them said. "We'll mark this down as a non-issue." Lisa forced a polite smile. "Thank you, officers." As the police left, Lisa stood on the porch, her hands trembling with a mixture of rage and frustration. Raymond was still standing there, watching, as if waiting for some kind of victory dance. She locked eyes with him, and for a brief moment, neither of them moved. The audacity of his actions left her speechless. He had called the police on her family, on her children, all because of his own hateful prejudice. But as much as Lisa wanted to march across the street and confront him, she knew it would only give him the satisfaction he was looking for. Instead, she turned on her heel and went back inside, slamming the door behind her. That afternoon, when Daniel came home, Lisa was waiting for him in the kitchen, her face tight with barely contained anger. He could tell right away that something had happened. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting his bag down and stepping toward her. Lisa clenched her fists at her sides, trying to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to spill over. "Raymond called the cops on us." Daniel's eyes widened, his body going still. "What? What did he say?" Lisa shook her head, her voice trembling with fury. "He told them we were causing disturbances. He accused us of loitering, Daniel. In our own yard. He's trying to make us look like criminals." Daniel stood there, absorbing her words, his own anger simmering just below the surface. "Did the police do anything?" "No, they didn't find anything." "But that's not the point," Lisa snapped, her voice growing louder as the frustration overtook her. "He called the police on us, Daniel. He's not just trying to make us uncomfortable, he's trying to ruin us." Daniel sat down at the table, running his hands over his face. "This has gone too far," he muttered. "We can't just keep letting him do this." Lisa nodded, her chest heaving with the intensity of the situation. "I know. I don't want to fight with him, but I can't stand by and let him treat us like this anymore." Daniel looked up at her, his face serious. "We're not going to fight. We're going to handle this the right way. He thinks he can get rid of us by making our lives miserable, but he doesn't know who he's dealing with." Lisa's anger began to subside, replaced by a determination that had been growing inside her for weeks. "You're right," she said quietly. "We're not going to let him win." The next few days were tense as the Jeffersons waited for Raymond's next move. He had already tried involving the police, and Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done. Every time she looked out the window, she saw him watching, waiting, like a predator circling its prey. But she refused to let him see her fear. On Thursday afternoon, just as Lisa was picking up Madison and Ethan from school, she noticed something odd as she pulled into the driveway. A group of neighbors had gathered across the street talking in hushed tones. Raymond was at the center of the group, speaking animatedly, his arms gesturing toward the Jeffersons' house. Lisa parked the car and watched them through the window for a moment, her stomach churning with unease. Madison and Ethan were in the back seat, chatting happily, blissfully unaware of the brewing storm. "Mom, are we going to the park after this?" Madison asked, her voice light and carefree. Lisa forced a smile. "Not today, sweetie. Maybe tomorrow." As she got out of the car and helped the kids inside, she could feel the weight of the neighbors' stares on her back. The tension in the air was suffocating, but Lisa held her head high. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. That evening, as the kids were getting ready for bed, there was another knock at the door. This time, Daniel was home. And when he opened the door, he found Susan from the HOA standing on the porch, looking apologetic. "Good evening," she said, her voice hesitant. "I hate to bother you again, but we've received more complaints from the neighbors." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Raymond?" Susan winced but nodded. "He's convinced some of the other neighbors that your family is causing problems. They've submitted a petition to have the HOA intervene." Lisa, who had been standing in the hallway, stepped forward, her face a mask of disbelief. "A petition? What kind of problems are we supposedly causing?" Susan shifted uncomfortably, clearly unhappy with her role in the situation. They've mentioned things like noise, disturbances, and, well, just general concerns about maintaining the character of the neighborhood. Lisa's hands clenched into fists. This is ridiculous. We've done nothing wrong. This is harassment, plain and simple. I understand how it looks, Susan said quickly, but the HOA has to take these kinds of complaints seriously. I'll do my best to handle it fairly, but I just wanted to give you a heads up. Daniel crossed his arms, his face tight with anger. So what happens now? Are you going to penalize us for living in our own home? Susan shook her head, her voice soft. No, of course not. But the situation is getting tense. I just wanted to make sure you were aware. Lisa's chest heaved with frustration as she watched Susan leave. This isn't just about noise or disturbances. It's about us. Raymond wants us gone, and he's trying to turn the entire neighborhood against us. Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. He's trying to break us, but it's not going to work. We've come too far for that. Lisa nodded, but the weight of the situation felt heavier than ever. They were surrounded on all sides, by neighbors, by petitions, by constant accusations. But as she looked at her children who were already sound asleep in their beds, she knew that no matter what Raymond threw at them next, they weren't going to give up. Because what Raymond didn't know was that the Jeffersons had a card up their sleeve that would change everything. The days stretched on, and with each passing moment, the Jeffersons found themselves more isolated from the rest of the neighborhood. The whispers, the stares, the subtle rejections from neighbors who once smiled in passing, everything culminated in an atmosphere of icy exclusion. But despite Raymond's relentless campaign, the Jeffersons held their heads high. They went about their lives with a quiet dignity, refusing to be beaten by the hatred that surrounded them. One Friday evening, as the sun began to set, Lisa sat on the porch with Daniel, sipping a cup of tea and watching the kids play in the yard. It was one of those rare moments where the tension seemed to lift, even if only briefly. The air was still, the sky painted in soft hues of orange and pink, and for a moment everything felt peaceful. But then, as if on cue, Raymond appeared across the street, glaring at them from his front lawn. His arms were crossed, and he was muttering to himself, shaking his head as if the mere sight of the Jefferson family offended him. Lisa caught Daniel's eye and gave a small, resigned smile. "He's never going to stop, is he?" she asked quietly. Daniel sighed, setting his mug down on the porch railing. "No, he won't. Not until he thinks he's won." Lisa looked out at the street, her mind wandering. "Well, he's about to get a big surprise, isn't he?" Daniel nodded, a slow smile creeping onto his face. "That he is." It had been weeks since the Jeffersons had quietly orchestrated the purchase of several homes on the block. While Raymond had been busy rallying the neighborhood against them, the Jeffersons had been making moves of their own, moves that would shift the balance of power in the neighborhood in a way no one could have expected. The deal was set to close today. The Jeffersons had been working closely with their real estate agent and legal team to finalize everything, and now they were just waiting for the confirmation that the sale had gone through. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lisa's phone buzzed with a new notification. She glanced down, and a smile spread across her face as she read the message. "It's done," she said, turning to Daniel, her eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "The deal's officially closed. We own the entire block." Daniel let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. "I can't wait to see the look on his face when he finds out." Lisa chuckled, but there was a hint of nerves in her laugh. "We've worked so hard for this, but part of me still can't believe it. After everything we've been through, to have this kind of power now, it feels surreal." Daniel stood up, stretching as he glanced across the street at Raymond, who was still pacing in his front yard, clearly stewing over some imagined grievance. "It's about time we take control of the situation," he said. "He's been trying to push us out, but now he's going to have to answer to us." The next day, the Jeffersons put their plan into action. It started with a quiet announcement at the HOA meeting, which Susan had called to address the ongoing issues in the neighborhood. Lisa and Daniel attended, sitting calmly in the back as Raymond and a few of his loyal supporters filled the room with complaints about the Jefferson family. "The noise, the disturbances, it's all too much," Raymond grumbled, standing at the front of the room with his arms crossed. "We need to take action. This neighborhood has gone downhill ever since they moved in." Lisa watched him with a calm, knowing expression. She could feel the anger in the room, the way Raymond's words fanned the flames of resentment. But she and Daniel remained composed, waiting for the right moment to speak. As Raymond continued his rant, Susan stood up, holding a clipboard and attempting to bring some order to the chaotic meeting. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice tense. "But before we move forward with any decisions, I believe the Jeffersons have something they'd like to say." Raymond scoffed, rolling his eyes as he stepped aside. "Oh, I'm sure they do." Lisa and Daniel stood up, walking to the front of the room with an air of quiet confidence. As they reached the podium, the room fell silent, all eyes on them. "We've been listening to all of your concerns," Daniel began, his voice steady. "And we understand that some of you may feel uncomfortable with changes in the neighborhood. But what you may not know is that Lisa and I have been working on something behind the scenes." Lisa smiled, taking over. "For the past few months, we've been working with a real estate agent to invest in the future of this neighborhood. And as of yesterday, we finalized the purchase of several properties on this block." The room went silent. Raymond's face turned an ashen gray as he stared at them, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. His eyes darted around the room, searching for some kind of explanation, but none came. What do you mean you've purchased several properties?" one of the neighbors asked, her voice filled with confusion. Daniel glanced at Lisa, and she nodded before answering. "We now own the homes on this block, including the one right next to Raymond's." The shock in the room was palpable. Raymond's face flushed red, and he sputtered, This can't be. You can't just buy up the whole neighborhood." "We can, and we did," Daniel said calmly. "And now that we're in this position, we plan to use our influence to create a more inclusive and welcoming community, one that values diversity and mutual respect." The room buzzed with murmurs as neighbors exchanged bewildered looks. For so long, Raymond had been the loudest voice in the room, but now the balance of power had shifted. The Jeffersons weren't just another family. They were now major stakeholders in the neighborhood. Raymond's eyes narrowed, and he stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You think you can just come in here and take over? You think owning a few houses makes you the boss?" Daniel met his gaze evenly. "We don't want to take over. We want to live peacefully, just like anyone else, but we won't be intimidated or pushed out by people like you." Raymond shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, storming out of the room. Lisa and Daniel watched him go, a quiet sense of victory settling over them. They hadn't just bought property, they had bought security for their family, a way to ensure that they would never again be vulnerable to the whims of people like Raymond. As the meeting came to an end, several neighbors approached Lisa and Daniel, some offering apologies for how they had been treated, others simply expressing their surprise. The tide was turning, and the Jeffersons could feel it. That evening, back at home, Lisa and Daniel sat on the porch once more, watching the sunset with a renewed sense of peace. "It's funny," Lisa said quietly, "how he thought he could control everything." Daniel nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "He thought we were just another family he could push around, but now he knows. Things have changed." Lisa glanced across the street at Raymond's house, where the lights were off and the curtains drawn. "He's going to have a hard time facing us after this," Daniel shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Let him stew. We've earned this." As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, the Jeffersons sat in comfortable silence, knowing that, for the first time in weeks, they had truly won. The future was theirs, and no one, not even Raymond, could take that from them. The air felt different after the HOA meeting. as if a weight had been lifted off the Jeffersons' shoulders. The neighborhood, which had once felt cold and hostile, was now subtly shifting. There was no longer a sense of isolation in the way the Jeffersons moved about their daily lives. People who had previously avoided eye contact or whispered behind their backs were now sending tentative smiles, small waves, and polite nods. It was as though the realization that the Jeffersons owned the very homes they lived in had caused everyone to reconsider their behavior. The change was slow, but it was noticeable. It wasn't just about the power the Jeffersons held now. It was about the moral authority they had earned by standing their ground, never once stooping to the level of their tormentors. One afternoon, while Lisa was outside watering the garden, one of her neighbors, Mrs. Perkins, an older woman who had lived in the neighborhood for years, approached her hesitantly. Lisa noticed her shuffling toward the edge of her driveway, and for a moment she tensed, expecting another confrontation. But when Mrs. Perkins finally spoke, her tone was soft, almost apologetic. "Lisa, dear," she began, wringing her hands nervously. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Lisa blinked in surprise, lowering the garden hose. "Sorry?" she repeated, unsure of what to make of the woman's words. Mrs. Perkins nodded, looking down at the ground. "I should have known better. I've lived here for a long time and I've seen families come and go, but the way some of us, myself included, treated you and your family, it wasn't right." For a moment Lisa was silent, processing what was happening. The admission, the vulnerability, this was something she hadn't expected. Slowly, she set the hose aside and walked over to Mrs. Perkins. "Thank you for saying that," Lisa said gently, her voice steady. "It means a lot." Mrs. Perkins gave a small, sad smile. "I wish I'd spoken up sooner. But people like Raymond, well, they have a way of making you feel like you don't have a choice. I just want you to know, not all of us feel the way he does." Lisa nodded, her heart warming a little. "I understand. It's not easy standing up to someone like him. But we've always believed that doing what's right isn't supposed to be easy." Mrs. Perkins smiled, and for the first time in weeks, Lisa felt a sense of community returning. This was what they had wanted all along, a neighborhood where they could belong, where their children could play without judgment, where people were seen for who they were, not what they looked like. Later that evening, as Lisa shared the conversation with Daniel, they both felt a growing sense of hope. Raymond might still be a thorn in their side, but the tide had clearly turned. The rest of the neighborhood was beginning to come around, realizing that Raymond's anger and hatred were his alone. "I can't believe Mrs. Perkins apologized," Daniel said, leaning back on the couch, a look of mild astonishment on his face. "I never thought I'd see the day." Lisa smiled, sitting down next to him. "I didn't either, but I think she, and maybe some of the others, are starting to realize that Raymond isn't who they want to follow. Maybe they're seeing that they don't have to be afraid of us." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "It's funny, isn't it? We're the ones who were being attacked, but now they're the ones who seem afraid." Lisa sighed, a thoughtful look crossing her face. People like Raymond thrive on fear, but once that fear is gone, they lose their power. The next morning, the Jefferson family continued to go about their lives, but with a newfound sense of freedom. The kids played outside with more ease, running through the yard, laughing loudly without the worry of disapproving eyes. Lisa worked in the garden, and Daniel spent more time outside, chatting with a few neighbors who had come around to exchange pleasantries. The small interactions, the cautious conversations, they were signs of healing, of a community slowly mending itself after weeks of tension. And though it wasn't perfect, it was progress. However, despite these positive changes, there was still one unresolved issue: Raymond. He had been noticeably absent since the HOA meeting. The blinds on his windows remained closed, and his car rarely left the driveway. It was as though he was hiding, retreating into himself after realizing that his plan to push the Jeffersons out had failed spectacularly. Lisa and Daniel couldn't help but wonder what he was planning next. But for now, they chose to focus on the good. the progress they had made, the peace they were beginning to reclaim. They refused to let Raymond dominate their thoughts any longer. One afternoon, about a week after the big reveal, the Jeffersons were sitting on their porch when they saw Raymond walking toward them. It was the first time he had shown his face since the HOA meeting, and as he approached, both Lisa and Daniel felt a mix of emotions: anger, frustration, and a strange curiosity about what he had to say. Raymond stopped at the foot of their porch steps, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The tension was thick, but Lisa and Daniel stood their ground, waiting for him to make the first move. Finally, Raymond cleared his throat, his eyes darting between them. I came to say something," he muttered, his voice low and gruff. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." Raymond shifted uncomfortably, stuffing his hands in his pockets. "I don't agree with what you did. Buying up the block like that, trying to change everything, it's not how things are supposed to be." Lisa crossed her arms, her expression firm. "We didn't do anything wrong, Raymond. We made an investment. We're not trying to change anything, we're trying to live in peace." Raymond looked away, his jaw clenched. "I don't expect you to understand, but this neighborhood isn't what it used to be. And people like you, well, you don't belong here." Lisa felt the familiar sting of his words, but she didn't let it show. "We belong here as much as anyone else," she said calmly, "and we're not leaving." Raymond's eyes flickered with something, anger perhaps, or frustration, but there was also a trace of something else: defeat. He knew he had lost this battle. He could feel the shift in the neighborhood, the way people were beginning to pull away from him and his toxic influence. For a moment he just stood there silent. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back across the street. His head hung low. It wasn't the victory the Jeffersons had expected, but it was a victory nonetheless. As the sun set that evening, Lisa and Daniel sat on the porch, watching the neighborhood slowly return to normal. The kids were playing with a couple of children from down the street, and the sound of their laughter filled the air. For the first time in what felt like months, the Jeffersons felt at peace. They had stood their ground against hate, against fear, and they had won, not through violence or anger, but through resilience and quiet strength. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but they had carved out a place for themselves, a place where they belonged. "We did it," Lisa said softly, leaning her head on Daniel's shoulder. Daniel smiled, his arm wrapping around her. "Yeah, we did." The street was quiet, the air cool and crisp, and for the first time in weeks the Jeffersons felt like they were truly home. As the days passed, the Jefferson family found themselves gradually settling into a new rhythm, one where their presence was no longer a source of tension, but rather a quiet force of change in the neighborhood. It wasn't that everything had magically improved overnight. Raymond's lingering hostility still cast occasional shadows, and there were still those in the community who kept their distance. But things were changing, and the Jeffersons were at the heart of that change. One Saturday morning, as Lisa sipped her coffee on the porch and watched the kids ride their bikes up and down the sidewalk, she noticed a few other families out and about, waving to her as they walked by. It was a small gesture, but it signaled something bigger, a shift in the way the neighborhood viewed them. Daniel came out, joining her on the porch with a satisfied smile on his face. "We're really making an impact, aren't we?" Lisa nodded, the morning light reflecting in her eyes. "It's starting to feel like a real community again." Daniel sat down next to her, gazing out at the street. "You know, I've been thinking," he said after a moment. "Now that we own the properties on the block, we should do something meaningful with them. Something that benefits everyone, not just us." Lisa turned to him, curiosity piqued. "What do you have in mind?" "Well," Daniel began, leaning forward with his hands clasped together, "what if we used one of the houses to create a community center, a place where kids can come after school, where families can gather for events, and where people can come together? We could offer classes, workshops, and maybe even start a community garden." Lisa's eyes lit up with excitement. "A community center? That's a wonderful idea, Daniel. It could bring people together, help build relationships, and make this neighborhood stronger. Daniel smiled, nodding. Exactly, and it would show that we're here to contribute, not just to live quietly on the block. We want to be part of something bigger. The idea of building a community center felt right. It was the perfect way to solidify their place in the neighborhood, to create something lasting that would benefit not only their family, but also the people around them. It would be a testament to their resilience and a symbol of the new legacy they were building. Over the next few weeks, Lisa and Daniel began working on their plans for the community center. They started with the basics, securing permits, organizing meetings with local contractors, and reaching out to the HOA and neighbors for support. To their surprise, many of the people who had once been cold or distant were now offering to help, eager to be part of something positive. "We never would have thought of this," Mrs. Perkins said one day during a planning meeting, her voice filled with admiration. "It's exactly what this neighborhood needs." Lisa smiled, glancing at Daniel. "We just wanted to give back and create a space where everyone feels welcome." As the word spread about the community center, more and more neighbors started to get involved. It wasn't long before the project became a focal point for the entire neighborhood. People offered to donate supplies, lend their skills, and volunteer their time to help get the center up and running. For Lisa, seeing the community come together like this was nothing short of miraculous. Just weeks ago, it had seemed impossible that they could go from being ostracized to becoming the driving force behind a movement of unity and collaboration. But now, the neighborhood was beginning to come together in ways no one could have anticipated. One afternoon, as Lisa and Daniel were discussing plans with the contractors on site at one of the houses they had purchased, they heard a familiar voice behind them. "Well, well, well, what do we have here?" They turned to find Raymond standing a few feet away, his arms crossed and a sour expression on his face. His presence immediately shifted the energy in the air, but Lisa and Daniel stood their ground, calmly waiting for him to speak. "You think you can just build a community center and everything will be fine?" Raymond sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You can't just buy your way into changing things around here." Daniel met Raymond's glare with a steady, unwavering gaze. "We're not trying to buy our way into anything. We're investing in the neighborhood, in the people who live here. We're building something that will benefit everyone." Raymond scoffed, shaking his head. "People like you don't belong here. You never have, and you never will." Lisa stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We're not going anywhere, Raymond. You've tried to push us out, but we're still here. And now, we're doing something that will make this neighborhood better. You can choose to be part of that change, or you can stay angry and bitter. But either way, we're moving forward." Raymond's face twisted in frustration, but he didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away, his retreat a sign that he had lost whatever control he thought he had. Lisa and Daniel watched him go, feeling the weight of his defeat in the air. "He won't change," Daniel muttered after a moment, shaking his head. "Maybe not," Lisa replied, her gaze following Raymond as he disappeared down the street. "But that doesn't mean we can't change the neighborhood around him." As the weeks passed and the community center began to take shape, the Jeffersons' vision became a reality. The once empty house was transformed into a vibrant, welcoming space filled with laughter, conversation, and the hum of activity. Families from all over the block came together to celebrate the grand opening, and even those who had once been skeptical of the Jeffersons' intentions were now fully on board, excited about the positive change they were bringing. The kids loved the after-school programs, the adults enjoyed the community workshops, and the neighborhood itself began to flourish with a renewed sense of purpose and unity. The Jeffersons had not only found a place for themselves in the community, they had become leaders, helping to build something bigger than any individual family. One evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood and the sounds of children playing in the distance filled the air, Lisa and Daniel stood outside the community center, looking around at the gathering of families and friends. "It's hard to believe we've come this far," Lisa said softly, her eyes scanning the crowd. Daniel nodded. his arm wrapped around her shoulders. "We've built something special here, and it's not just about us, it's about everyone." Lisa smiled, her heart full. "We've built a legacy." The next day, as the Jeffersons prepared for another busy afternoon at the community center, they received a knock at the door. To their surprise, it was a group of neighbors holding a beautifully framed plaque. The leader of the group, a man they hadn't spoken to much before, stepped forward, smiling sheepishly. "We wanted to give you this," he said, handing them the plaque, "as a thank you for everything you've done for the neighborhood." Lisa and Daniel exchanged surprised glances before looking down at the plaque. It read, "In honor of the Jefferson family, for leading our community with strength, grace, and unity." For a moment they were both speechless. The gesture, the recognition, it was more than they had ever expected. But as they looked around at the smiling faces of their neighbors, they realized that this was the culmination of everything they had fought for. They had not only earned the respect of their community, they had helped transform it. "We don't know what to say," Daniel said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to say anything," one of the neighbors replied. "You've already done more than enough." As the Jeffersons accepted the plaque, they felt a deep sense of pride and accomplishment. They had come to this neighborhood as outsiders, but through resilience, perseverance, and the strength of their family, they had built something lasting. They had created a legacy of unity, one that would continue to grow long after Raymond's bitterness had faded into the background. The Jefferson family had won, not just for themselves, but for everyone. The Jeffersons' journey from being isolated newcomers to respected pillars of the community had been nothing short of remarkable. Looking back on everything, it was hard for Lisa and Daniel to believe how far they had come. What had started as a hostile environment filled with tension and prejudice had transformed into a neighborhood where families connected, kids played freely, and barriers were slowly breaking down. One evening, as Lisa sat at the dining room table, reviewing plans for the next event at the community center, she found herself lost in thought. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions: frustration, anger, fear, but also hope, pride, and ultimately triumph. She glanced at the framed plaque that now hung on the wall, a testament to all they had achieved. Daniel entered the room carrying 2 cups of tea. He placed one in front of her and sat down across the table, a contented smile on his face. "Penny, for your thoughts?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. Lisa chuckled softly, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "I was just thinking about how much has changed," she said. "It's hard to believe this is the same neighborhood we moved into just a few months ago." Daniel nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Yeah, it's amazing. But we didn't just change the neighborhood, we changed ourselves too." Lisa smiled, her eyes reflecting a quiet sense of accomplishment. "I think you're right. We learned how strong we are, how much we can endure. We faced so much hostility, but we never let it break us. And now, look at what we've built." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their tea and reflecting on everything that had brought them to this point. The battles they had fought, the confrontations they had endured, the small victories that had added up to something much larger. They had been tested in ways they never expected, but in the end, they had come out stronger. "I think the most important thing we learned," Daniel said after a moment, "is that sometimes the only way to fight hate is with resilience and love. We could have fought back with anger, but instead, we built something that showed people who we really are. And that made all the difference." Lisa nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "We didn't just survive, we thrived. And in doing so, we helped this community thrive too." As the weeks went on, the community center became a thriving hub of activity, bringing people together in ways that had once seemed impossible. The Jeffersons organized events that drew in families from all over the neighborhood, from movie nights to cooking classes to holiday celebrations that filled the air with laughter and warmth. The center was more than just a building, it was a symbol of what was possible when people came together. Even Raymond, though still largely isolated, had grown quieter. He no longer stormed out of his house or made a show of his discontent. His once dominant presence had been diminished to a mere shadow, a reminder of the way things had been before the Jeffersons had arrived and changed everything. But Lisa and Daniel knew that this wasn't just their story. It was the story of every family who had come together to make the community center a reality. It was about the people who had once been afraid to speak up, who had once followed the loudest voice in the room, but who had now found their own voices. The legacy they had built wasn't just for themselves, it was for everyone. One Saturday afternoon, during a busy community event, Lisa and Daniel stood off to the side, watching as children played in the yard and adults mingled, chatting and laughing together. The air was filled with the sounds of joy and connection, and the atmosphere was one of peace. As Lisa watched the scene unfold, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. This was what they had fought for, a place where people could come together, where differences were set aside, and where love and unity triumphed over hatred and division. Daniel, standing beside her, smiled. "We did it," he said quietly, echoing the words they had spoken so many times before. But this time they felt different. They felt final. Lisa nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. "Yeah, we did." Just then Mrs. Perkins approached them, her face beaming with pride. "This is wonderful, you two," she said, glancing around at the lively scene. "You've truly made a difference in this neighborhood." Lisa smiled warmly. "It wasn't just us. It was all of us coming together." Mrs. Perkins nodded in agreement. "That's true, but you two were the spark that started it all." As Mrs. Perkins walked away, Lisa and Daniel shared a quiet moment, letting the significance of it all sink in. They had come to this neighborhood hoping for a fresh start, but what they had built was so much more than that. They had created a place where people could belong, where they could feel safe and accepted. They had built a legacy of love and resilience that would carry on for generations to come. As the evening drew to a close and the families began to leave, Lisa and Daniel sat together on the porch, watching the last of the children ride their bikes down the street. The stars were beginning to twinkle in the night sky, and the air was cool and crisp. "I feel like we've come full circle," Lisa said softly, leaning her head on Daniel's shoulder. Daniel nodded, his voice filled with contentment. "We've come a long way." Lisa took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill her lungs. "We didn't just survive," she said, echoing their earlier thoughts. "We thrived." And as they sat there side by side, watching the world settle into a peaceful silence, they knew that no matter what challenges came their way, they had the strength to face them. Because they had built something that could not be torn down, something that would endure long after the memories of their battles had faded. They had built a legacy. As the Jefferson story comes to a close, it's a reminder of the power of resilience, love, and unity in the face of adversity. No matter what challenges we face, we all have the ability to stand strong, to rise above hate, and to create something lasting and meaningful. What would you do if you were in their shoes? Have you ever experienced a situation where you had to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against you? Share your stories in the comments below, and let's continue the conversation about the power of community, resilience, and love. And if you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others who need a reminder that no matter what we face, we have the power to build something beautiful.